tous.
Good
Alors avant
afternoon.
peut-être de demander s'il y a des questions
First
dans la
of all,
salle, et je vais
we
utiliser la
may
technique
ask
d'Hugo tout à l'heure, le temps de vous
whether
laisser préparer vos
we
questions.
have
Moi j'ai quelques questions
questions.
aussi à poser.
I do have a
À
few.
chacun d'entre vous, d'ailleurs, je vais commencer par Ando.
I'm going to start
Ok.
with Andrew.
Andrew, on a bien
Andrew,
compris la
we
façon
understood
dont vous
how
gériez les
you
crédits
manage ex-ante
ex-ante
credits,
etc., la façon dont
ex-post
ça se
credits,
passait,
how
avec effectivement
what happens
cette
there
vérification autour de
with
l'audit
this
et le passage donc
audit.
à l'espace à ce moment-là. Mais dès le départ,
And
lorsque
from
le
the
crédit est
beginning,
ex-ante,
when
le
the ex-ante
propriétaire
credits,
peut vendre
the owner
déjà
can sell
ce crédit-là.
the
Et
credits,
est-ce que le fait que ce
and
soit
the
un crédit
fact
ex-ante
that
par
it's
rapport à
an
ex-post, est-ce que ça
ex-ante
a une
but not
incidence sur la valeur,
ex-post,
compte
does
tenu
it have
effectivement
an
qu'il y a un
incidence
risque
on the value?
d'un
Because there
audit
is a risk
après qui
of an
ne
audit
permet pas
that will
de
not
devenir ex-post. Donc est-ce que ça a une
validate the
incidence sur la
credit.
valeur,
Does it
ou
have an
est-ce que
impact on the
ça
value?
peut après avoir une répercussion
Or can it
finalement
have
si l'audit est défavorable
an
avec une
impact if
restitution
it's
de
a
prix
negative
dans
audit,
le cadre de la vente?
restitution of the price?
Thank you. Yeah, that's so just to confirm the question, it would be, taking you through the process of ex-ante versus ex-post credits. Is there a risk that an ex-ante credit won't deliver? It won't become an ex-post credit, and does that have a value? Does that have an effect on the price of that unit? So yeah, absolutely. And what in our ex-ante, ex-post process, each unit we have has a serial number. So not only do we know the amount of credits that are ex-ante that are going to convert at each verification, we know which ones in particular. So even within those ex-ante units, the ones with higher serial numbers are less valuable than the ones with lower serial numbers, because we convert from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So when you're buying your credits as a carbon buyer, as a corporate, you'll always be wanting to buy the units that are the lower end of the verifications, the ones that are likely to be converted first. Not only are you doing that because they're closer to verification, so I could buy a PIU from you, an ex-ante unit, that had a likely conversion date, a vintage is how we call it, like a fine wine. We could have a likely conversion date of 2100. I would buy that from you for no more than £1.50. But if you had a PIU, an ex-ante unit, with a conversion date of verification of next year, I'd be paying £50, £60 for that. So not all PIUs, not all ex-ante units are the same. And within that, they have different risk profiles, because the later you buy, the more likely it is that there's going to have been a reversal or there's going to be a loss of carbon. So what we're finding is early on, the carbon buyers were very rough, very general, just saying, oh yeah, I'll buy 1,000 units, not really understanding what they were buying. Whereas now, the carbon buyers are far more savvy, they're far more intelligent, and they're saying, I want these units from you. And within that legal contract, they're building in for their company protections against those sort of risks. So they'll say, right, I'm buying your later units, which have more risk. Therefore, you have to guarantee me that if they aren't delivered, you have to go elsewhere to a different landowner and buy the equivalent number of units to provide to me. So the balance of responsibility between landowner and buyer is a bit of a battleground at the moment. So one thing we're doing is we're developing a template legal contract that buyers and sellers can both use, and it presents all of the normal terms. We talked last night about a force majeure sort of situation. Some buyers are quite compassionate and they say, look, you're doing everything you can. We know there is a risk. So what we'll do is we'll buy a few more just in case some do burn down, but you're not going to be liable to have to buy from other people. So it's that constant balance. What's fair to put risk on one person in comparison to another?
Thank you. Une autre question alors, encore une autre, une deuxième question. Tu as parlé à plusieurs reprises dans ta présentation des co-bénéfices, et c'est quelque chose qu'on a entendu à plusieurs reprises ce matin, donc dans les dossiers, la présentation, et vous l'avez fait aussi, Solène, des co-bénéfices. Aujourd'hui, sur le label bas carbone tel qu'il existe et sous le contrôle d'Hugo et de Simon, les co-bénéfices existent, mais ils sont là pour davantage valoriser de façon supplémentaire, au moins en termes d'image et de communication un projet. Est-ce que c'est le cas aussi dans le système que tu connais, ou est-ce qu'il y a aussi une valorisation supplémentaire de ce co-bénéfice? Parce qu'il ne serait pas illogique d'envisager qu'au sein de l'ensemble des paiements pour services environnementaux, puisque le carbone c'est bien ce que l'on appelle un paiement pour service environnemental, il y ait effectivement le carbone qui soit un socle et qu'il puisse y avoir des options, y compris avec une valorisation financière supplémentaire, qui viennent rémunérer ces co-bénéfices supplémentaires qui viennent se rajouter. Est-ce qu'il y a une valorisation supplémentaire de ces co-bénéfices dans ton système?
Again, just to confirm, so is there additional benefits to the carbon credits if they have these co-benefits bundled in with them? Absolutely, and I think it's important to remember, as been referenced a few times, that this is still the voluntary market, and so we're not in the compliance market in the UK. At the moment, there are a lot of calls from the UK emissions trading scheme, the UK ETS, to include these voluntary credits. I personally don't think we're quite ready for that yet. There are complications, as you know. But anyway, when it comes to the value of these units, as I say, it's a voluntary market, so the corporates are usually wanting to tell a story about what they have done. They're not just wanting to say, we're carbon neutral. They don't have to say they're carbon neutral. They're doing it partly marketing, some for the right reasons, some for the wrong reasons, but they're doing it for that story. And in a way, Selem, as you were describing as well, when these companies are wanting to buy these units, they're looking to be able to also market all the associated benefits as well. So if I was a company wanting to be able to say, we are carbon neutral, and what you were saying about a tangible, local, we can take our customers, we can take our staff, look at this woodland that we've created, that is a big driver for these organisations. And so what we're finding is biodiversity is king. They're really wanting this credit, this ecosystem service really high on the agenda. So we're seeing a marked difference in the value of mixed broadleaf credits versus commercial conifer credits. And it's mainly driven by that biodiversity benefit. But they are looking now, Hugo, we talked last night about being able to split out these different credit types. And I don't know where France and the rest of the EU are really with that. But being able to say this woodland generates 1,000 carbon credits, but it also generates 1,000 biodiversity credits. I'm going to sell the biodiversity credits to you, but the carbon credits to you. You're not allowed to say anything about biodiversity, and you're not allowed to say anything about carbon. That's the direction of travel that people want to see, being able to break out these different ecosystem services.
Okay. Merci. Une question pour notre ami d'Akena.
A question for our Akena friend.
Un petit peu piquante. Dis-moi, on a vu
We
que sur
saw
le référentiel de la bas carbone, il y a principalement plus de
that
référentiels
there are more
que
agricultural
forestiers.
references than forest
On voit
references. We
qu'il y a
see
eu beaucoup de
that
diagnostics qui ont été faits, donc énormément d'énergie.
a lot of diagnoses were conducted and a lot of energy went into
Et
it.
malgré tous ces diagnostics-là,
And in
on
spite of
s'aperçoit
that, we
qu'il y a
realize
finalement assez peu de dossiers
that there
que voulu qui arrivent
less
jusqu'à l'utilisation finale.
applications
Il a quand même
that
dit qu'il y avait effectivement un certain nombre de blocages.
are
Aujourd'hui, ces blocages
become
sont des blocages
actual projects.
administratifs.
Where is the
C'est des
blockage?
blocages
Is it
financiers,
administration?
c'est
Is
des
it
blocages
finances? Is it in terms of culture? What can we do to develop a low carbon label in agriculture? It's everything. From an administrative standpoint, is complex. When an advisor goes to a farm, there is first a diagnosis. It must be transparent, and we must transmit all the data from the farm. There are certifications that must be supplied. It takes about 2 days with a farmer to just from an administration standpoint to initiate the application. So the farmer needs to dedicate 2 days from the beginning. Some farmers are interested. They want to do it, and they're proactive and more sensitive to climate change issues and to the carbon issues.
Une fois qu'ils ont décidé ça, ils définissent des leviers
Once they decide that, they decide a plan of action for a farm, and depending on the potential, they're going to obtain a compensation. When we talk about an average compensation of 20 to 30,000 euros over 5 years, some farmers say it's complex. I have risks to set up agroecological actions that you recommend. I estimate that the compensation you propose is not sufficient to put that in place. So the low-carbon label tool is very good to raise awareness, to start thinking. But if you want to go to a phase where we want to have a large-scale transition, we have to have a higher compensation, or you will need to have more support of the farmers to limit their risks. Thank you. And one last question for Salem. What are the obligations for a funding company in the projects, in the forest projects, the funding companies that you contact? You talked about communication, and generally around these obligations, how do you concretely make sure that the funding company met its obligations before thinking of compensation? Because compensation doesn't mean anything if you don't talk about avoidance. So what are the steps, what steps are you taking to make sure that the compensation is only on what is residual? It's complicated to answer that question. Some companies that completed their carbon balance and they want to reduce their footprint are quite a few. So to have quality criteria on the pathway, we're not able to do it at this stage. It's not because we did the carbon balance that you start a transition. For us, the only tool available to us at the carbon cooperative, there is the price signal. It's not 6 euros per ton. And when a company comes to offset all of their carbon balance and to find the tonnage, the right tonnage, they're not going to come to us. They're not compensate at a high price per ton. They want a carbon credit for a lesser cost. So this limits that risk. The other tool we have, and it's more operational, we have an ethical commission for sensitive cases that we may have to train territory stakeholders. We recently had the case of an actor that wanted to contribute. As a seller of a credit carbon, we cannot refuse contributors. But it's a voluntary market, so why can't you refuse? I think legally we cannot do it. What article is it? I don't know. I don't know the answer.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Quelles sont les questions dans la salle?
Any questions in the audience?
Monsieur Simon, oui c'est Simon. Oui.
Simon.
Une lettre, ce sera plus simple. Simon.
Alors j'ai une question.
I have a question.
Je vais essayer de poser aux trois intervenants.
For the three speakers, Joanne mentioned the fact that the farmers took a risk by getting into the low-carbon label. And I think that in the Woodland Carbon Code, there is an interesting device that Andrew did not mention.
Je vais essayer de le décrire en
I'll
deux mots,
try
mais
to
la
describe that
première
in
question
two words,
auprès
but my
d'Andrew, ça serait
question
de
to
décrire
Andrew
plus en
is
détail.
can you describe
C'est
it more in
que
detail?
l'État
Is that
anglais
the British
propose de
state
garantir le
proposes to
rachat de crédits
guarantee
carbone
the buyback of
à
carbon
des
credits
forestiers qui
from
s'engageraient sur le Woodland Carbon Code.
forest owners that
Et donc ils ont un
are in the
contrat
Woodland Carbon Code. They
dans
have a
lequel l'État
contract
dit,
where
moi, je vous
the
engage
state says,
à racheter à un
I
prix
will
plancher.
buy back at
Donc est-ce que Andrew, tu pourrais nous en parler un peu
given
plus?
price. If
Et
you
puis,
find better, you
pour
can go
Joanne
somewhere
et
else.
Solène, est-ce que
And
vous
then
trouvez
Joanne
que
and Solène,
ça serait une solution
do you think that would
intéressante
be
pour
an
mieux
interesting
accompagner les
solution
agriculteurs dans
to
leur
work
prise de
better
risque?
with the farmers in their risk?
Yeah, that was great, Simon, thanks. So that's the Woodland Carbon Guarantee, is what you're describing. And that's only relevant in England, which highlights the difference and what we're trying to balance between Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland and England. So what the Woodland Carbon Guarantee is, it's less about, you mentioned initially, about farmers taking risk. So it's de-risking it from a financial perspective. So what they do is it's a reverse auction process. It's a bit messy, it's a bit complicated, but the nuts and bolts of it is that the the English government will say to landowners, right, we will offer to buy only your ex-post units. We have no interest in your PRUs, your ex-ante units. And we will buy all of the WCUs that are generated before 2055, if you choose to, for a price we will agree now. So the way it works, if all of us were landowners in England, we would all bid in this reverse auction and say, to make our project viable, I need £20 per unit. And that's index linked, interest rate linked, and so that does go up over time. But I will say I need £20, but Solène may say, well, I only need £15. And so her units are prioritised over mine. And then there's a budget per round, and there's a couple of rounds each year. And what that allows for is the people that succeed in that auction, that get a contract from the government that says, if you want to sell elsewhere, crack on. If the private market price you're going to get is going to be higher, not a problem. But if the price of carbon collapses, let's say nuclear fusion saves us all and says, right, carbon sequestration isn't needed, we've got it. And then voluntary carbon market isn't needed. And the landowner is like, great, I've just spent tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds to make this woodland creation scheme happen purely based on the private price of carbon, and that's fallen out. And the government will still buy your credits for that agreed price. So you're protected financially. And for some investors, that is huge. They can go to the bank when they're taking out the loan and say, look, we know that this is the absolute worst case scenario for the sale of our carbon credits. And that makes a really big difference for some of them. Most of them, though, don't care, because the price of the carbon they get on the private market is so much higher than the government offering. What it did do, as just a final point, is it stimulated the market enormously, because I was in the carbon market in the UK at the time when the first auction was introduced in about 2019. And before that, there were examples of people selling their carbon units through the Woodland Carbon Code at £2 per tonne, £3 per tonne. And then the week later, there's an auction, and the average price of that auction was £24 per tonne. And they were thinking, I've just given away all of my credits for nothing. This is awful. So every landowner from that point on started demanding way higher prices. Companies realised how valuable this was. Investors realised the potential for this asset. And that really steamrolled the code. So it's from 2019, 2020 that the interest in the code exploded, massively due to this.
Peut-être une réponse de l'un des deux sur est-ce que cette solution vous semble quelque chose?
What about this solution? What do you think of it?
Je pense qu'il faut explorer toutes les mécaniques.
We need to explore all the mechanisms to credibilize, to make the systems credible. We learn by walking. The carbon market is young, and we're trying to market carbon credits from the first farmers. And we realize at the agricultural level that we have an image deficit towards the contributors, the image of a farm that will have less greenhouse gases, or that with a cattle farm that is less virtuous than someone who plants a tree. And the second difficulty is that we have a price which is higher. It's minimum 45 euros per ton. So we need to develop a communication to reassure the contributors on the accuracy of the action implemented. And I think that we need to include the co-benefits at the territorial letter. What's the interest of farming, of cattle farming, of cereal growing or legumes growing in the territories. And this is what we need to communicate tomorrow with the public at large. Today in France there are about 500,000 tons of carbon credit. Only 20% are being sold. So if we cannot find ways to sell them, I'm afraid that the farmers will tell us, wait a minute, you're selling things 32 euros, for instance, but we don't have any buyers. Because that would be, it's disconnected from the global carbon credit market. And then we're looking at all actions possible. The English initiative can be a source of inspiration, of course.
Oui, bonjour, merci. Donc, pour contribuer à ce débat, je vais prendre un peu le regard des financeurs.
I'm going to look at the financing companies. We looked at the project leaders, but my name is Olivier Fonceur. We are a forest operator. We work throughout France. The funding company, pays for a project. He buys a carbon credit on a year end, which is an anomaly, which is what they tell us. It doesn't make sense because what they buy is going to produce its effect for 30 years for the low carbon label. So I think it's interesting the proposal of the European framework to set a time limit of 20 years. I think it's interesting. One of a way to accelerate the funding of contributors in the project is that the investment are considered as assets that can be amortized over 5, 10, 20 years. And I think that there is a European framework in accounting where we can do it for green investments to depreciate these assets for so many years. I don't know whether some of you in the audience or in the panel is aware of any ways to depreciate these assets. Maybe I can give you an answer. This is what we talked about in a forest meeting a few years ago. Today, for a company, the fact that you have created carbon credits is an expense. It's not an investment that can be depreciated. And this is part of the proposals qui ont été à la discussion au moment de l'assise. Et le point qui a bloqué l'évolution de ce projet-là, c'est que la façon dont ça a été présenté de façon très globale, c'était de dire qu'il faudrait aussi évidemment que ce soit un investissement, mais qu'en plus ces droits-là deviennent accessibles pour l'entreprise qui les a achetés. Et en fait, c'est ce point-là très précisément qui avait un blocage de l'État dans les discussions. Je me souviens en disant non. On veut surtout pas we don't want the funding company to sell back the credits. We don't want any speculation around the credits. And this is around that point that the situation was blocked. Mais c'est vrai que c'est une, à mon avis, vous avez raison. You're right, it's a real possibility, and it should be investigated with the government agencies.
S'il y a d'autres questions,
Any other questions?
Madame Laporte.
Mrs. Laporte?
J'aurais été déçu, Madame Laporte, si vous n'aviez pas eu de
I
question.
would have been disappointed if you hadn't asked the question. In what Mr. Baker said, two things called my attention. When there is a problem, when there is a fire, the forest owners don't have to reforest. I don't know what it's like in other European countries. In France, I know it's different. And we were told that the peatlands would be reforested. If I were European, I would scream, because wetlands are the most interesting on the planet, whether by the Ministry of Environment, both in France and in Brussels. I have some concrete experience. In the Natura 2000 directive, there are strict regulations in terms of the wetlands and the habitats that were included in the directive. We should remove from the directives, what's in there because of the British. I'm sorry, Mr. Baker, because there are wetlands without any trees. Concerning agricultural projects, I would like to ask the representative from the Chamber of Agriculture of New Aquitaine. Some forests are working, but I heard that there would be solar panels in wetlands, and imagining that the cows would continue grazing under them. Do you include in projects under examination, do we include the integration of solar panels that are a priority in the forests of the Landes, where we don't take into account the collateral damages of power lines? So biodiversity is a very interesting subject. Okay, there are so many questions there. Andrew, we will start with you. You want to reforest the peatlands?
No, we don't. So don't you worry. No, thanks for the questions. So first of all, when there are fires, not having to replant. So under the Woodland Carbon Code, you absolutely do have to replant. What happens if you were to plant a woodland in the UK and it was grant supported? For the duration of that grant, which is usually around 10 years, if there was a fire, you would have to replant. But beyond that period, you've got no obligation. So if you owned a forest that was 50 years old and it burnt down, you could just say, and let natural regeneration take its course. If it's a Woodland Carbon Code scheme, you do have to replant. Regarding the peatlands, so the reason I mention peat so regularly is because it's, as you say, critically important, and we have a really rich peat resource in the UK, particularly in Scotland and parts of England. And the reason I mention it is because it cannot be planted, and they are regularly reducing the amount of peat depth that can be planted on. So 5 years ago, you could plant on areas that had up to 50% peat, then it to 45. In England now it's 30. So they're really, really careful about not planting on peat because, as you say, drying that out by planting on it is just a surefire way of emitting carbon dioxide as quickly as you can. So there are some really, really strict regulations on wetlands and peatlands.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Et oui, il y a des initiatives d'agrivoltaïsme
there are initiatives of solar panels. There is a national framework that's being discussed between the farmers, the the developers of solar panels and the government. I'm not a professional in this topic, but solar energy should be developed only on lands with low agricultural potential that are very steep, but not all the agricultural land are covered with solar panels. But it's
Très bien.
Oui, monsieur. Oui, j'avais une question simple.
I have a question for Joanne. You told us about the national figures on the efforts from the agriculture for 2050, 45 or 46% of reduction between 30 years from now. And the example that was very useful of the milk producer in the Basque Country showed that with non-neutral efforts for him, he can have 6% gain. Are we going to be able to obtain the national objectives with this type of initiative?
The answer is not going to be an individual for the reduction at 50%. That be the sum total of the sector of research, which will give you a hypothesis of evolution. I've taken the example of a farmer who committed to the low-carbon label, and what we notice is that the low-carbon label helped us to operate simple levers contributing to a reduction of 6%. We're not at the 46% which are targeted. There's still a very big step to go over to reach those objectives. But making aware the farmers to put in place the technical environment necessary to support the farmers in their transition is important, because the challenge is a huge one, and that's the title of today's day, Challenges and Opportunities. Make of this challenge an opportunity for tomorrow's farming, and there's stakes of adjustment to climate change which will force practical modification to suit.
Merci.
Thank you.
On a encore un petit peu de temps pour d'autres questions.
A few more questions. We still got time.
Oui, Adeline.
Yes, Adeline.
Oui, moi j'avais une question de compréhension.
A question of understanding for Mr. Baker. When you presented at the very beginning the UK system, you explained that it's a system which is supported by the government and which is compulsory to be able to announce that you are carbon neutral or net zero, sorry. In this context, I mean, what is the place in the UK for other certification systems, voluntary certification systems? Does that mean that the companies are not allowed to use this terminology in terms of communication on carbon neutrality if they use another certification framework? I mean, I couldn't understand really what this particular point. If you could clarify it, maybe?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and as you said, I didn't go over it as much as I could have, so I do apologise. So what I should have explained more clearly was first of all, the Woodland Carbon Code, the credits that we generate, or the landowners generate through us, can only be used by companies with UK-based emissions. And so it could be a French company that had a regional office in the UK, and they were offsetting specifically their UK-based emissions, but for their French emissions, they can't use our units. Now, that's to avoid some of the thorny issues around corresponding adjustments and nationally determined contributions and that sort of thing. So it's only to be used to offset against UK-based emissions. When I said about if anyone was wanting to generate carbon credits from woodland creation in the UK, they have to come through us. That doesn't mean that as a company, I couldn't buy some credits from Gold Standard or Vera internationally and still make those claims. What I couldn't do is there are no voluntary standards at the moment endorsed to a high enough level within the UK, because Vera and Gold Standard at the moment don't operate woodland creation schemes in the UK. If they did, then they would be able to, so a company would be able to use either woodland carbon co-credits or Verra or gold standard credits. But at the moment, the only carbon standard for woodland creation schemes in the UK is us. So, as I say, there's nothing to stop them. And previously I worked in the private sector in the carbon world rather than in the government. And when I was working there, a lot of buyers, they're expecting a sales pitch. Why is woodland carbon code the best? Why can't I just buy from Verra? And I'd always say, fill your boots, crack on, buy from Verra. There's some great schemes that they've got, and their credits are a lot more immediate than ours are, because we're waiting 10, 15 years. So a lot of companies are looking at blending the carbon units that they buy, some from us, some from other standards. And so that's an option for them. So I'm sorry I didn't explain that as well as I could.
Merci.
Thank you.
Moi, j'en ai une question.
I've got a question
pour Solène.
for Solène.
Vous qui êtes au plus près des financeurs.
You're closest to the funders, but it could be a question for La Forêt because you know them too. I mean, did you manage to define a kind of typology of the companies interested in the funding of low carbon in terms of activity sector, in terms of size? Do you have a kind of typology as far as the funders are concerned, or they could be any type, traditional companies, 2-3 people, larger companies? I mean, is there some kind of logic behind all this? Common characteristics. On the local carbon market, the national market is setting himself up with a low carbon label. We had funders on the voluntary markets on carbon, trying to look for carbon credit abroad, and that's a type of buyers asking themselves about getting their funds back to France. Then I'd say that we've got some companies, and I mentioned that earlier on, with an incentive approach, thinking about the reduction of their carbon footprint with a process which is quite long, on which the funding of the farming carbon project can lead the whole of the sector and farmers together, farmers who are committed. Then there are all the companies wondering about the regeneration. How do I become a regenerative company? That's another type of companies, and for them the quality of the project is very important, and they really do want to be involved on projects on the territory. Their entry key is the equivalent CO2 that they're looking for, and that's the approach that we're trying to have, to take with us all the companies, no matter what maturity stage they're at in those projects, and that's what we're trying to do at the territory level with companies who just want to be part of a territorial project and supporting the transitions which are ongoing. So there's a budget to be allocated for a project for them with a positive impact. I think that is going to change a lot, it's going to progress a lot. I mean, we've got carbon footprints which are done even with the smaller companies, and these companies with their carbon footprint assessment in a few years from now, once they will have this carbon accounting system in place, I think that we're going to find them on contributory projects.
Oui, donc je ne peux que confirmer.
I can but confirm the reading that's just been done. To add on, I mean, there's a specificity for a few years now. It's the climate resilience project. We've got some voluntary contributing stakeholders internationally at 10 euros per term, looking for volume and price ratio. But there's also the contribution, the compulsory voluntary contribution, which are the larger contributors. for the low carbon label. And again, it's price versus volume. So what we see is that there's a greater awareness to the mutation risk. Their target is to be able to start displaying a net zero strategy or a net zero trend, but it must not expose them to anything. So there's a demand of project quality and also of expert of a great expertise, which has increased a great deal over the last few months as to the quality of the projects and specifically as regards to biodiversity. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions, Madame?
Any other questions, Madam?
Pardon. Non, juste très rapidement.
No, very briefly. I mean, we were talking earlier about
pour la coopérative carbone,
for the carbon cooperative of support
les entreprises sur aussi une
to companies through time, and I had a question as to the loyalty and the progression. What you've noticed with the companies contributing every year, and with sometimes this progression in the idea of getting in line with the national evolution scheme. Yes, indeed. I mean, that's something that we're trying to do. And that's what we observe, because the contribution is not an action which is just a one-shot action, but something which is done from one year to the next with the question, what project are we going to find this year? It's true that companies are eager for new things, and we got to be able to bring them a carbon project which meets with the challenges of the year. But yes, there are companies that we find from one year to the next, and we also find in the reduction strategies too.
Nous avons une question de Roland Delary.
Question of Roland Delary. Yes, Roland Delary, Director of the National Center for Forest Ownership. Online with the previous question, do we feel some kind of competition with Mécénat?
Alors Eric, il est modérateur.
Eric is a moderator, so he can't answer you.
La question. Donc la question de Roland. Je ne sais pas qui veut répondre. Oui, c'est Solène qui va répondre.
Alors peut-être que ma réponse devrait être complétée.
Talking about sponsorship, I mean, I don't know whether it follows the same budgetary lines as patronage or sponsorship. The approach, when we're talking about the contributors, they know that it will be an expense.
On a des entreprises qui
We've
se posent
got
la question.
Companies wondering about it.
À vrai dire, ma réponse
My
va pas être très
answer
claire parce
will
qu'il est
not
compliqué
be
en tant
very clear
qu'opérateur de
because
se
it's
rendre compte
complex
aussi
as
ce
an
qu'il y a sur
operator
le
to
marché
realize
et où
what's
sont
available
alloués
on the
les
market
budgets.
and
Mais
where
je
the
pense que
budgets are
concrètement,
allocated.
certaines
But
entreprises
concretely,
préfèrent
some
le
companies prefer the patronage or sponsorship element.
On va poser la même question.
Same question asked to Andrew, but not knowing how it works in the UK, this system of sponsorship or patronage, does it exist or not? Do you have this competition for corporate sponsorship and carbon funding on your territory?
Yeah, it's interesting the way you describe it as competition between sponsorship versus the purchase of carbon credits, because again, because I work for the government now, for the public sector, it's no skin off my nose. If someone wanted to sponsor a company for some woodland creation and not make any formal claims or buy carbon credits, it doesn't really matter to me. So from our perspective, the more companies out there doing this sort of thing, the better, whether they go down a sponsorship route or a carbon crediting or ecosystem market route. What we've found is historically a lot of companies went down that sponsorship route. It'd be a really easy thing. I don't know if you've heard of like the Woodland Trust and Wildlife Trust. It's a lot easier for a company just to say, if there's a Tesco, for instance, for every 6 eggs you buy, we will give 10 pence to the Woodland Trust. It's a really easy thing. They don't have to track anything or anything like that. They're not making any formal claims. They're just saying, look, we're doing a good thing. And that was quite easy for them. What we're finding now is, you've all heard of greenwashing. I heard a term recently called green hushing, and that's where companies are getting terrified of making formal claims. So I've actually seen the pendulum swing towards being able to say we're carbon offsetting, we're biodiversity neutral, we're water neutral, whatever it may be. And now they're getting so scared because when they make a claim, that's up for legal challenge, and companies are being taken to court. There's a famous few cases in America where companies were fined millions for making incorrect claims. And so it's swinging back partially to, let's just sponsor a company. We don't need, it's voluntary carbon market. We don't need to say we're carbon neutral, and it's far safer ground just to say we're going to give the Woodland Trust £1 million. So because we've talked already about the lack of credibility and lack of trust in carbon markets in particular, that has really had some long-lasting consequences, and I worry that it's going to be a long time before there is that real confidence again in the carbon market. And so sponsorship, as I say, is an easier route, a cleaner route in many ways.
Merci.
Thanks, Madame Carrère. Do you have a question? Did you raise your hand? No, sorry, mistake.
Eh bien, nous avons le temps pour une dernière question.
Okay, one time for a final question.
No.
Final question? No,
Écoutez,
no.
c'est pas moi de conclure.
I don't have to conclude. Hilary will do that. But I would like to say a couple of words maybe before handing over to her. I'm not going to thank all the speakers and the quality of their production, but I do sincerely think that I would like to thank you really, with Tony and Hugo, all three of you, for the huge work that you've done to organize this working day. I know that because I was next to you, watching you work, because I didn't do much at all, but I can witness that you worked hard for this very interesting session. We always learn a lot of things. I expect to have the presentations and the acts to follow and to help us keep in touch. Thank you very much to all three of you. And I'm saying that from a personal standpoint, but also on behalf of Bruno Lafont, the chairman who had to leave to attend another meeting in a hurry. But I'm sure that he would appreciate me telling that. Thank you very much. Thank you to the last round table. Thank you, Eric, for the moderation. And we've got to the end of this day. As we've been able to see this morning, different initiatives already exist at different scale, regional with the Basque Country of the Valais, national level with France or the UK, European Union also involved in this topic with the certification framework, trying to harmonize some voluntary carbon market aspects and an opportunity for the owners and the companies, though attention has got to be focused on the integration of what already exists and the tools. Given the present people today, we can see that this subject is highly interesting different people with different profiles. We think that it's important to continue meeting like that and continue discussing with one another to reinventing the wheel. It's been mentioned several times this morning. And we are happy to having welcomed you here today for this event, and we thank you for your presence. We hope that this day is only a beginning that will be followed on by different other such meetings, and we will be present with great pleasure. Thank you to all the speakers, thank you to all the assistants, and thank you very much to the translators and the technicians, of course, who've helped us throughout the day. And a big thank you to our organization colleagues, Hugo and Eric. So see you soon. Thank you very much for being here with us.